بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير، الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن أعملا وهو العزيز الغفور، الذي خلق 7 سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت، فارجع البصر هل ترى من فطور، ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا وهو حسير، ولقد زينا السماء الدنيا بمصابيح وجعلناها رجوما للشياطين وأعتدنا لهم عذاب السعير، وللذين كفروا بربهم عذاب جهنم وبئس المصير، إذا ألقوا فيها سمعوا لها شهيقا وهي تفور تكاد تميز من الغيظ، كلما ألقي فيها فوج سألهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم نذير، قالوا بلى قد جاءنا نذير فكذبنا وقلنا ما نزل الله من شيء إن أنتم إلا في ضلال كبير، وقالوا لو كنا نسمع أو نعقل ما كنا في أصحاب السعير، فاعترفوا بذنبهم فسحقا لأصحاب السعير، إن الذين يخشون ربهم بالغيب لهم مغفرة وأجر كبير، وأسروا قولكم أو اجهروا به إنه عليم بذات الصدور، ألا يعلم من خلق وهو اللطيف الخبير، هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور، أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور، أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاصبا، فستعلمون كيف نظير، ولقد كذب الذين من قبلهم فكيف كان نكير، أولم يروا إلى الطير فوقهم صافات ويقبضن ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير، أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن إن الكافرون إلا في غرور، أمن هذا الذي يرزقكم إن أمسك رزقه بل لجوا في عتو ونفور، أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم، قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون، قل هو الذي ذرأكم في الأرض وإليه تحشرون، ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين، قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين، فلما رأوه زلفة سيئت وجوه الذين كفروا وقيل هذا الذي كنتم به تدعون، قل أرأيتم إن أهلكني الله ومن معي أو رحمنا فمن يجير الكافرين من عذاب أليم، قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين، قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتيكم بماء معين، صدق الله العلي العظيم. الفاتحة.
سورة المباركة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحتق العصم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تقطع الرجاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبت وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متضلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانئا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وألا مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لقبائه ساترا ولا لشيء من عملي الخبيث بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من خبيث سترت وكم من فاده من البلاء أقلت وكم من إثار وقيت وكم من مكروه دفعت وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرت. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرت بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني النفع بعد آمالي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومثالي. يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك أن لا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور أتوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، أسأله كشف الضر والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي، أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أحوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك، وخالفت بعض أوامرك، فلك الحجة علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاءك، والزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا مؤترفا، لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة الضر وفكني من شد وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدا خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي، حبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك، وبعد ما انتوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولحج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات، أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيت، أو تبعد من أدنيت، أو تشرد من آويت، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، وتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارها سعت إلى أوتان تعبدك طائئة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم. يا ربي، وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثور، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل الوقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي، فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستقيم. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها ضج وأبكي، لعليم العذاب والشدة أم لطول البلاء ومدته، فلئن سيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فحبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجاء عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا لئن تركتني ناتقا لأذجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآملين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاكدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفتك، وذاك طعم عذابها بمعصيتك، وهبس بين أتباكها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيجا معملا لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يعمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أتباكها وأنت تعلم صدقا؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا رب؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاهدك وقضيت به من إخلاد معاندك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كان لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك، أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين، وأن تجل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتتولت بالإنعام متكرمة. أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستعون. إلهي وسيدي فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها أن تحبلي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمت وكل ذنب أذنبت وكل قبيح أسررت وكل جهل عملت كتمته أو أعلنت أخفيته أو أظهرت، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني، وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيت وبفضلك سترت، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته، أو إحسان فضلته، أو بر نشرته، أو رزق بسدته، أو ذنب تغفر، أو خطأ تستر. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك مأمورا، وبخدمتك موصولا، وأعمالي عندك مقبولة، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي يا من عليه مؤولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب، قوي على خدمتك جوارحي، واشدد على العزيمة جوانحي، وحبلي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك، حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، وأسرع إليك في المبادرين، واشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك ذنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، واجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فأرده، ومن كادني فكده، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك، وجد لي بجودك، واتف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لحجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأكلني أثرتي واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة. فإليك يا رب نسبت وجهي، وإليك يا رب مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني منايا، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع الرضا اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء وسلاحهم البكاء. سلاح البكاء. يا سابغ النعم، يا دافع النقم، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلم، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل بما أنت أحله. وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله، وسلم تسليما كثيرا. سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
Sayyid Hasan, Rizvi, respected elders, dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum, Jamia wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for all marhumin listed on the screen, as well as all other marhumin. Surah Al-Mubarak Al-Fatiha. Ashfa Maries is requested for all those who are in need here and elsewhere. Let us recite together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ. Ya Allah. Let us now invite Sayyid Hasan Rizvi to please come forward and recite tonight's majlis. By Muhammad wa Muhammad salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، خاتم النبيين، شفيع المذنبين، رحمة للعالمين، سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Mu'mineen, mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we had some Slido questions that we'll start with, left over from the past 2 weeks. So we'll start with those, inshallah. Then we'll have our main question and topic for tonight, which is also left over from a week or two ago. And then we will, after a musibah, then end with a short Slido quiz. Okay. First one is, what's your favorite soccer team? I don't watch soccer, so I don't have a favorite team. Done. Easy. Okay. Next. Well, should we get rid of the joke ones first? Yeah. Okay. Let's get rid of that one. Next one is, in a burger, does the ketchup go under or on top of the lettuce? It goes in the garbage because ketchup is absolutely disgusting, and it's something that you give to kids in order for them to eat food. But it's not something that any adult or anybody with adult taste buds should be eating. So please don't eat ketchup. It's nasty. Okay, so that was easy too. Great. Now let's go to the real questions. Okay. Let's say, rhetorically, I'm 22 and I've never smoked a cigarette before. Can I start to vape a nicotine vape? Rhetorically, of course. Okay, so first of all, rhetorically spelled wrong. Second of all, if it's rhetorical, then that means I don't have to answer, right? A rhetorical question is when you don't expect a response. So if you really mean it rhetorically, that means I shouldn't be responding to it. So I think you mean like theoretically or something like that. Okay. So many are under the impression that there's this fatwa that exists out there that states that if you haven't started smoking, then you're not allowed to start. And that if you are already smoking, then you can continue. This is some understanding that's there. I can understand the confusion because if you look on some of the Q&As, on some of the websites, or some people's explanation, it may seem like that's the case. If you look closely at the wording of the Q&A of the fatwa, it says that a person, if they believe that there's going to be extreme harm from starting smoking, if they believe that, then they cannot start smoking, right? So that's the way it is. It's conditional. And we answered this smoking, vaping, nicotine, we answered those questions 2 weeks ago. So whether it's starting, whether it's stopping, whether you're in the middle of it, whatever it is, everything goes back to the principle of harm that we talked about. So if you didn't hear that response, you can go back, I think it was a week or two ago, where we talked about the idea of tobacco, of smoking in general, according to Ayatollah Sistani, hafidhahullah. So I hope that rhetorically you got your answer. Okay. We as U.S. citizens pay taxes to the U.S. government. Most certainly, the money goes to the oppressors against, I'm assuming you mean either Palestine or Emperor Palpatine. I'm assuming you mean Palestine. Doesn't that mean we are supporting Israel? Well, so there's a few different things here. So we as U.S. citizens pay taxes to the U.S. government. Yes, most people will elect to do so. There are some individuals who figure out ways to evade paying federal taxes or don't pay it. I'm not going to go into details about people who do that or not. There's obviously a price to pay. There's a risk involved. There's a documentary about this done by the late Aaron Russo called From Freedom to Fascism, where he discusses the idea of the federal income tax and how there's a whole movement that believes that it's unconstitutional and there should be no reason for it. Khair, if you're interested, you go and do the research. For everybody else who does pay taxes every year, federal income taxes, right? Because there's no state tax in Florida, right? Alhamdulillah. So for the federal income tax, we know that the taxes that we pay get divided up and go to various different programs. Part of it goes to healthcare and Social Security and Medicaid and all these other things. And a part of that is for the defense budget as well. Part of the, they call it defense budget. It's not really for defense normally. It's meant to attack. It's an aggressive budget, right? They changed the name of Department of War to Department of Defense for a specific reason. So some people think that, okay, because our money is going to countries like the Zionist regime and our tax money is going there, therefore it's haram to pay taxes, or they make all these sorts of conclusions. Well, step back a little bit. Whenever it comes to giving out your money to anything, whether it's a company, whether it's a government, meaning you're paying your taxes, yes, it's possible that a portion of your money is going to something that as a Muslim we don't agree with. Obviously, we know the fatwa, we don't support the Zionist regime, right? We don't support any oppressive regime, that's clear. But just because a part of it may go to it doesn't mean you're not allowed to get involved with it, right? Meaning it's not like you have to avoid paying taxes. Why? Because we know that there's so many other programs that taxes do end up going to. And again, this is not me pushing for you to pay taxes. You can do whatever you want, it's not up to me. But if you do that, it's going to build roads, for example. Again, all the other parts of your tax money can go to those other places. So the Maraja say, since it can be divided like that, and you have no absolute certainty that you're assuming whatever, let's say you owe $5,000 one year. So you pay your $5,000. You would have to have absolute certainty that Uncle Sam took your $5K and directly gave that to the Zionist regime like the IDF, right? And it specifically went to something to oppress the Palestinians. There's no way of knowing that, and most likely it's probably not the case anyway. So they say when there's that doubt and shak in where your money is being spent, and there is a good chance that there are other places where your money is going to go, then there's no haram involved in that place too, right? Because then technically, let's say, I'm not encouraging this as well, but those of you who go and shop at pretty much any supermarket or any convenience store or any fast food restaurant where they're clearly serving haram things, right? They're serving pork or non-halal menu items, alcohol, etc. So just because, when we pay for something, they're profiting from that, right? You buy a bunch of groceries, they're going to profit. You go to a restaurant, they profit. From that profit, somebody might say they might go and buy their supplies, right? They're going to go buy alcohol or pork. Well, okay, maybe, but you don't have absolute yaqeen. Right? Unless in the cash register, as you're paying, it says, your proceeds are definitely going to us to buy a case of wine. Right? Unless you would have that yaqeen, then it would be haram, but nobody has that yaqeen. These things get lost, right? So there's shak there. So when there's that doubt, when you don't have absolute certainty that your money is going for these haram issues, then that there's no issue there, right? You are allowed to pay taxes. And the other part of the fatwa that the Maraja mentioned is that whenever there's a huge personal risk involved. So for example, let's say somebody decides to take what they believe is the moral high ground, the akhlaqi position, and say that, you know what? I know that a part of my money might go to the Zionist regime, so I'm not paying taxes. Okay, fine, that's your decision, no problem. Now, because of that, let's just say the IRS comes after you. The IRS comes after you, and maybe you end up going to jail. Because you end up going to jail, now you've left behind your spouse and kids. And now maybe there's no income in the house, whatever it is, right? Assuming your spouse doesn't work, whatever. So your kids are hungry, your wife is left alone. Your wajib duties now, you've kind of ruined everybody's life by doing this. So they say, look, when you're in a state of idtirar, of zururat, when there's a necessity, if you avoid a certain action, it's going to put you in more haraj and hardship, then you can't really avoid it. So in this case, most would argue that you can't really avoid taxes just like you can't avoid death, as they say, right? So in that case, then they say that also makes it allowable to pay taxes if you choose to do so. Okay. Recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Okay, so should be the last one, then we'll go to our main topic. Is playing classical piano haram? So we've discussed music, not instruments specifically, but music we've talked about, I believe, maybe 2 years ago. I think in last Ramadan of 2020, we had 2 or 3 sessions on it, if I'm not mistaken. So you can go back to look to the details. But the overview is this. The fatwa from Maraji, such as Ayatul Sistani, hafadhahullah, is that whether it's playing or listening, if that music is suitable for a haram gathering, then you're not allowed, right? So if the type of piano music that you're playing is something which would be suitable for a haram gathering, then you're not allowed to play that. Usually the example that people end up using when they want to apply the ruling is they say, look, classical music, normally people don't associate that with haram gatherings. So that's the example they give. Now, maybe some of you do associate it, that's your choice. Most people, I don't think in this day and age, would associate classical music with haram gatherings. So this is the example they normally would give and say, yeah, there's no problem in learning classical, playing classical, etc. Right? So the way that this question is phrased, again, generally speaking, this would be okay, inshallah. Okay, so let's move on to our main topic now. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So there were 2 questions that had come up within the community over the past month or so. One of them we had addressed previously, which was about this idea of awwal al-waqt, waqt al-fadila, the best time to offer salah, and we talked about this past 2 weeks, in our past 2 Thursday nights. The other question that came up, and it's one of those that seems to always come up in communities every time. It's one of those that ends up coming up in a Q&A, especially when there's a visiting speaker or a scholar. There's somebody there who has to ask the question, right? Even though they heard the answer, they're going to ask it again anyway, right? Because they want their own answer. And it's about mixed gatherings, gender integration, segregation, partition, no partition, all of this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different points to discuss when it comes to this topic, right? About what are the proofs for it, the hadith, the fatawa. I don't want to go into detail, right? Because, as usual on Thursday nights, we have limited time. But if we really want to boil down the discussion, we don't really have to go into too much. The main boundaries and the borders are the fatawa from the Maraji, right? And that's what we have to work with. The main issue is then once we understand the fatwa, or the different fatawa and the rulings, the boundaries and the borders that have been set in place, then the real question happens to be, okay, now that we have the boundaries and the borders, we know our halal, haram, our sharia, what logistically is possible and what logistically or spiritually is beneficial for us as a community. Not for everybody else, not for some other center or some other masjid, for us as our community, what makes sense for us given our circumstances, the breakdown and the ability that we have here. That really is the main question here. So first, let's start off with the actual fatwa. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So I'm hoping most people, they do know this, right? In terms of actual, again, segregation, integration, mixing, whatever word you want to use. The fatwa are pretty much generally the same, no matter which marja you ask, again, in terms of the mainstream contemporary maraja. And it's that, look, as long as proper hijab is maintained, then, quote unquote, having men and women in the same area without a partition or not doesn't really matter. There's no issue there, right? As long as proper hijab is maintained and there's distance, involved, they're sitting on separate sides, there's no issue there, right? Usually, the issue that comes into play when there's a question about can we do this kind of session or not do this session, and when they actually get involved in the haram nature of a gathering, would be, will the people here, is there a good chance that they will fall into sin? Whether men or women. If there's a good chance that they're going to fall into sin, then this is where there'd be a problem with that type of gathering, right? Even if, let's say, hijab is being maintained. If there's a fear that people will get involved in haram, then that would not be allowed, right? So that's sort of the main criteria, is the fear for getting involved in haram. In the actual fatwa themselves, and if you look in, as far as I've seen, in any book of fiqh, and you can correct me if I missed it, partitions or no partitions, they're never really mentioned. And the reason for that is because now we take a trip back into history. A lot of the progressive, let's say liberal Muslims that exist right now, what they like to quote is that at the time of the Holy Prophet, Rasulullah, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. They say, look, at his time, there was no partition. It came afterwards, and their conclusion, therefore, is therefore, we don't need a partition. And therefore, you can go and mix. Say, hold on, slow down. Just because it didn't exist back then at that time does not mean, we can or cannot do it. That's not how, fatwas work. That's not how we prove things. It's one way, it's good to know the history, definitely. But, let's understand exactly what was happening there. And many of you maybe have heard this before. Many ulama have written articles about this. They've spoken about this. So I'm sure most of you know the general history. But just as a friendly reminder. In history, when the first masjid basically was built, they say that the way that Rasulullah would advise the companions is that make sure that, because there's only one single entrance at the beginning, there's only one door for everybody to come in. So the akhlaq that was established and practiced then was to make sure that men and women would enter at separate times. And therefore they would also leave at separate times to make sure there was no sort of, mixing or bumping into, each other's shoulders. So normally then you would have the men coming in first so that they could fill up the front lines, right, for salah. Then the women would come in afterwards so they would fill in the back rows as well. And this is also where you can link some of our ahadith. So these are linked to the Prophet and some of the A'immah as well, where they would say that the best sufuf, the best lines for a man is in the front, whereas the best lines in jama'ah for a woman is in the back, right? Because then they're delaying and they're making sure they're not mixing with others. So this was the beginning of Islam, right? Just one little doorway, men would come in, women would come in afterwards, and when they were leaving, Rasulullah would say, look, men, stay behind a little bit longer. So normally, after the last salam was done, right? And at the end of salah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, women would normally get up right away and they would leave, and the men would stay around for a little while. So normally the ta'aqibat was generally in the beginning something that men would do more so. The women would either on their way home or when they got home, they would do their ta'aqibat then. And this would be a practical way for men and women not to brush shoulders in the masjid. So this was sort of the beginning. Later on, at the masjid, finally, then a separate doorway and an entrance was constructed for the women. So now this issue is not available anymore. Right? This issue is not going to happen. Men and women were entering from separate areas. Right? So again, we ask those who are trying to push the sort of progressive liberal agenda, say like all this sort of mixing is fine. Say, look, if all that's fine, then why was there the emphasis on making sure men would come in first and women after? Men leaving later, women leaving first, separate entrances. There's a push for there to be some sort of distancing. There's a push by the Rasulullah to make sure that people are not, bumping into each other. So the basic idea of segregation definitely is there. And it's in the history as well. Now, coming to the partition idea, let's go to there. Again, there are some differences in terms of the history. But let's stick with the fact that, fine, let's say there was no partition during the time of the Prophet. Okay, fine. And let's say we agree that maybe, perhaps, it was something instituted later on by some of the khulafa. Okay. Now, one opinion that I've heard some people say is because one of the first three khulafa did it, therefore we shouldn't be supporting that idea. Right? That's one argument that I've heard from the Shia side. That the first three khulafa did it, and Rasulullah didn't do it, so we shouldn't do it. I said, hold on a second. The real question is this, that let's say a partition was put in place, right, by one of the first three khulafa. Let's say that's the case. The question then that a Shia layperson or an alim needs to ask themselves, or especially the progressive or liberal, is that, look, even if one of the first three khulafa instituted the practice of a partition, the question is, did any of the A'imma afterwards, specifically Imam Ali, alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa did he remove it or not? And as far as most scholars would agree in history, no, he didn't remove it. So it was something instituted and it was there. In terms of the other imams, you don't see anything which says get rid of the partition. Right? So we don't have any sort of wording like that from the A'imma. So in that sense, somebody can make the argument that, look, even though it was instituted there, because we have evidence from the words of the Ahlul Bayt, whenever they disagreed with the practice from the first khulafa, they would come out and say it. They say, this practice of, what they're doing here is not allowed. We should undo this practice or, do this, do that. They would come out and they'd speak against that, right? Like Taraweeh. They said, look, this is not a part of what Rasulullah established. So you shouldn't be doing that. We don't have anything like that from the Ahlul Bayt in terms of setting up a partition. So that's one thing. Now, again, somebody might jump and say, see, that means we have to have one. Well, again, this is slow down, right? That's not, let's jump to conclusions right away. The next part of it is this. Why exactly did, if we're going with the historical idea that one of the first three khulafa, usually they say Umar, the second Khalifa, they say he was the one who established it. Some say it was Abu Bakr. Khair. Again, we don't necessarily care who did it. Why did they establish it? If they knew that Rasulullah didn't, what was their reasoning? What do the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, what do they have in their history, and what would we, in a sense, kind of agree to and point to as well? What did they talk about? What were the issues of the time which caused any of these khulafa to institute putting in something which Rasulullah did not do? So let's discuss that quickly. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, what the Ahlul Sunnah, if you look at their arguments, because they are dealing with the same sort of discussions we have. In many of their communities, they have partitions set up. Not every community, but some of them do. So it's not just a Shia-specific thing. In many Sunni communities, they've had the same argument, right? So the sort of liberal, progressive, and then feminist types will say, get rid of it, let us mix, women can lead namaz, all that stuff. And then you have the traditional, classic, quote-unquote, backwards-minded saying, no, we have to keep all the partitions and segregation and all of that. So their response, even to the ones who agree that, look, Rasulullah didn't institute the partition, they say, look, however, the reason that Rasulullah didn't need to put one there is because of the fact, and going back to the same initial point we mentioned about the fatwa from the Maraji, is because the women of that time and the men of that time were practicing Islamic haya, modesty, and hijab properly. There is no reason to. In the actual masjid, there wasn't any mixing going on, right? Any haram mixing. They weren't, mixing and doing things they weren't supposed to do. Hijab was being done properly by both genders. Now, where there was an issue was out in the streets sometimes. So after they would leave the center, after they would leave the masjid, sometimes they would go in the streets and they would mix and talk. And Rasulullah would go and address that separately. He'd say, look, don't do this, don't talk like this in the street, you need to be separate. He would tell women, stick to one side of the road, don't walk in the middle amongst men. This is inappropriate, right? It's not good. So he addressed that separately. But in terms of inside the masjid, it was never an issue for them. They had a sense of respect for what took place, as a place of ibadah in the masjid. What we see, according to some historians, is that after the shahada and passing of Rasulullah, is that this hijab, this haya, started to dwindle a little bit. They started to deviate. And when this happened, the khulafa, again, if you agree with this version of history, they said, look, The reason why we didn't need a partition is because people were observing the rules. But now, because let's say both genders are not following the rules properly, we have to institute a practice to save the idea of Islamic hijab. We have to save this haya and modesty that Rasulullah was trying to implement. So in a sense, it was kind of like a fail-safe device. So look, if you're not going to observe hijab properly, then this is a sort of temporary solution that we can offer. This was sort of the argument that was given, that has been given and is given right now. And if you look in the works of many of the past ulama, whether Sunni or Shia, these are the arguments that they give. Most of them won't give an argument that Rasulullah did it or the Imams did it. They'd say, look, if you see that haya and hijab is failing in your center or community, then you're going to have to, this seems to be the most practical idea. Set up something so that women who, let's say, need to, whose hijab is not the best, or men who can't control their gaze, or who are getting stuck in guna, things like that, then this seems to be the best pragmatic approach to making sure that nobody gets stuck in guna. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So, now this is a general history. Now, what do we do about our own communities now, right? Now that we talked about the fatwa, we've talked about a little bit of the history, we have to talk about logistics here. That's the main sort of question. Because on one side, you'll see people who are pushing and say, look, everybody just come in the same exact room, no partition, right? That's one side of the argument. Others will say, no matter what, there needs to be a partition in place, no matter what. Okay. And I like the way that, many ulama, like Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi, may Allah give him a long life, has put it, is that, look, you have to look at the goals, the hadaf, the maqsad, of what you're trying to accomplish with your functions, with your sessions. What are you trying to get across? Will your ideas, the goal of your function, will it be fulfilled with or without the partition or not? Right? That's the question you think about and you try to answer. So, many would argue that you can have a session where women are behind a partition and they can watch on the screen, and there's no issue there, right? Because they're watching, a monologue majlis, so there's no problem there. My question to anybody who has that opinion, all right? So if women have that opinion, that's one thing. For the men who say, no, there has to be a partition for the women, right? So that they, we don't get caught in guna and they don't get caught in guna. And it's fine for them, let them watch, watch the TV screen or whatever, right? From another room or whatever it is. Okay. My question is just this. We've been dealing with a pandemic now. We dealt with it for about a year and a half, right? Or for the first few months initially in this community, everything was virtual. Now you tell me, as all the men are sitting right here, are you telling me there's no difference between watching a lecture on a TV screen versus watching a speaker come here in person? If you're saying that there's absolutely no difference whatsoever and it doesn't affect your focus, your concentration, and your ability to grab that information, then listen, either you're stubborn, you're a liar. I don't know which, right? But I can't accuse anybody of that, but I think you're being dishonest. I think we all know that there's a general difference between virtually, watching something on the screen, as all of you are watching things at home for a long time, versus being actually here in person. I mean, any of you who sit outside during the lectures as well. I mean, I know. There's an easy, it's an easy chance for you to have a side conversation, this and that. It's probably not going to happen over here, right? You can easily use your phone outside, right, in the middle of it, because I won't see you, although even if I see you now, you're not going to, it doesn't matter, you're still going to do it, right? I don't care if I see you or not. But there's clearly a difference. Now, somebody may respond, say, okay, hold on a second. Can we achieve the Islamic goals of proper modesty with or without the partition? Is there logistical ways that we can go about doing that, right? Because some men might say, look, if women are in the same room as me and I know that there's no partition, I might get caught in guna. Okay, fine, fair point. Some women might say, look, I want to practice the Islamic ideal of not being seen or heard by any non-mahram. Okay, that's also valid too, right? People want to stick to the Islamic ideals. They have every right to do that, no problem. And there may be others who say, look, it's not going to bother me if I'm sitting in the front and women are sitting in the back and there's no partition because I'm not going to turn around and look, right? So we have people who are on all different sort of walks of life. How could we possibly, again, this is just thinking out loud. I'm not saying we have to do this or we don't have to do this, but it's us, a way for us to think out loud. For those who have been to other communities, other centers, or even other Islamic countries, how have they been able to implement these ideas? Meaning the ideal Islamic way for men and women to be separate, and also the idea that Islam is also family-oriented and focused as well. I want to be able to sit sometimes with my wife and kids. I can't do that here, right, in a lecture. If you go to certain centers, or if you go to, any of you have been to Iran, right? For example, like the harams of Bibi Ma'asuma alayhi salam and Imam Rida alayhi salam, you have the ability to do that. Every single option is available for you. If you want to sit in a male-only section, there's a male-only section. If you want to sit in the women-only section behind a partition, that's available as well. But the main sahan, the main areas are family-oriented, meaning people come and they sit as families. And they're doing this in the middle of a normal lecture or a majlis. Over there, they've been able to build up a culture over years where everybody's practicing proper Islamic hijab, right? They check this as people are entering. So if somebody's not wearing proper hijab, then the khadims, whether on the men or lady side, will say, here's a chador or whatever, you have to fix this. Or they'll tell them you have to remove your makeup, etc. So they make sure proper hijab is being maintained, and then they give everybody the option which suits them best. So one possible way for us is to figure out logistically, is that a possibility? Can we make it in a way where there's an area where men who want to be, not around any non-mahram women, is there a way they can do that? Okay, for example, again, I'm not saying do this, but for example, maybe you can have men sit in the green room, right? Because they would be there, they can watch on the screen, and there'd be no women allowed, for example. Then let's say you want to have women who don't want to be in the presence of non-mahram, no problem. Then they can go on the ladies' side, right? For example. But then let's say you want to have families. Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to put them in this main hall. All three of those objectives could be met. You would have men, for example, who'd be, alone by themselves, right? Separate from non-mahram. You'd have women with the option in a separate place to do that as well. And then you'd have families who'd be able to do that as well. Again, assuming everybody's observing proper hijab. So there are ways of maintaining the idea of partition, meaning the idea of the ideals of Islamic hijab, if you want to do that. But there's also other goals that we can discuss and maintain and think about too. So the purpose here is not to say partition or no. The purpose of this discussion is to get us to think about the history, the fatwa, and the logistics that are available to us, and the idea that we need to understand how to cater to all the different groups available, all the demographics available in our community, without intentionally or unintentionally pushing people away. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Okay. There's a few other points here, but I'll leave that aside for now, and then we'll talk about it maybe in another session. One more salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We talked about the ideal of hijab as well. And that's something definitely that can't be underscored. The ideal place for a lady, for a sister in Islam, in the words of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, is to never to be seen by a non-mahram, to never to be heard by a non-mahram. And you see that the members of the Ahlul Bayt, the women of the Ahlul Bayt, they practice this as much as possible. Whenever possible, they would make sure that they were never identified. Even the women who would attend the Jama'ah Salah during the time of the Prophet, they'd say that they would cover themselves head to toe completely so that they could never even be recognized. The men of the community, even if they happen to see people out in the street, a woman, let's say, leaving Jama'ah prayers or coming into Jama'ah prayers, because they were completely covered, they would never be recognized. So this was an Islamic ideal that had been held up always. And you see, this is the same thing which breaks our heart when we see specifically this is something that Umar ibn Sa'ad, la'natullah alayh, this tradition he wanted to break. And he wanted to try and attempt to take away the dignity of the women of the Ahlul Bayt. And we see this on Sham al-Ghariba, when the men ransack the garments of the women. When we see that as they're taken to Kufa, and as they're made to wait outside the walls of Kufa, because it's nighttime, and they would like to enter at nighttime. But Umar ibn Sa'd says, no, we wait over here so that we can parade the women around during daytime, because they've never been seen like this before. We want to parade them around like slaves, without their haya, without their hijab like they used to have. This is the way that the Ahlul Bayt, this is the way that the Ahlul Bayt were treated by the enemies of Islam. That even though they wanted to live up to these ideals, the enemies of Islam wanted to take that haya and that modesty away from them. And this is why Bibi Zainab had, they say, according to historians, had cried out and said, I had never been, when I had come to Kufa, my Mawla, my father Ali, had always made sure that I would come at night so that no man would ever see me. But now look at me for the first time being dragged through the streets of Kufa with all the eyes of the non-mahram staring at me like this. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره صلوات على محمد وعلى محمد. Okay, so let's quickly start our quiz, inshallah. So, assalamu alaikum to everybody. I'm not going to tell anybody to subscribe to that channel and follow their Twitch. They're under no obligation to do that. Just me, Abu, MJ. Then my screen froze. Saint Nick, Rais, MJ, RJ, Labbaik. Maybe we'll wait for one more and then we can get started. I think it's good enough. Let's get started. To Khwaja. Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started, inshallah. The word Nabi comes from a verb which originally means what? To be high, elevated, to give news, A and B, or none of the above. So I think we went through this discussion about a month ago. That either the word Nabi comes from Naba'a, or Naba, or Nubu, or Naba. Asant. Most of you got it right. It is A and B. It can either mean to be high and elevated, which means a Nabi is somebody who has a high elevated position, or it can also mean somebody who gives news, meaning he's a Nabi because he gives khabar from the higher metaphysical planes, which we don't have access to. Second question. Praying in jama'ah is better than praying by yourself. In what situations? Always, as long as the jama'ah happens as soon as salah time begins, as long as it happens within 15 minutes after salah time begins, or as long as jama'ah happens before the fadila time ends. So the concept of jama'ah versus furada and awal al-waqt and waqt al-fadila, again, we've talked about in the past two sessions. And this specific issue we talked about last week. Okay, so there's some 50-50 split confusion here. So it's the final answer, right? As long as the jama'ah happens before fadila time ends. If the jama'ah takes place after fadila time, then according to Ayatul Sistani, he says that there's no clear evidence to say whether your furada on time or in fadila is better or a jama'ah after fadila. So there's no clear evidence that jama'ah is going to be better like that. Okay, third. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had instructed his followers to use what method to make people more religious? The scientific method, pushing others to perform the mustahabbat, recommended actions, being lenient, persuasive, and building brotherhood and sisterhood, or all of the above. I think I forgot to put a timer on this one. Most of you got it right. So it was being lenient, persuasive, and building brotherhood and sisterhood. Remember the story he mentioned where there was a new Muslim convert, and this new Muslim convert was being dragged, the whole day to the masjid, and the next day he quit Islam because he said this was too much for me. So the Imam told his companions the story. He said, look, understand people's different backgrounds, understand their capabilities. Do not force people into doing all of these things when you don't understand their capabilities, right? So we need to be careful of pushing all the mustahabat and the high sabah of akhlaq on everybody when they're not ready for it, right? So we have to be lenient, persuasive, and we have to build brotherhood, sisterhood, and understand everybody's spiritual capabilities first before making decisions. Okay, final question. Which of the following men does not have a chemical element named after him? Sir Isaac Newton, Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, and Enrico Fermi. So this was a tough one. Yeah. So most of you got it incorrect. So the minority got it correct. So Isaac Newton doesn't have anything named after him. There is no such thing as Newtonium. But there is bohrium, there is Einsteinium, and there is fermium. All of those have their elements named after the bottom three. Okay, let's see who won tonight. I guess because you won, I have to say it. So first place is subscribe to KSI 313 and follow my Twitch. Again, just because the person won doesn't mean you have to do it, but I guess maybe one or two of you can subscribe and follow since they got first place tonight. And the only one to get 4 out of 4, so great job. Nice job. And the rest of you, Labeik, St. Nick, Leah, and Khoja, some tough ones tonight. I guess the toughest one was the non-Islamic one, or un-Islamic, or not un-Islamic, but non-Islamic one. Okay. Inshallah, we will be commemorating and celebrating the wilada of our beautiful Lady of Light, the daughter of Lady Fatima, Sayyidah Bibi Zainab alayha salatu wasalam, next Thursday. So we'll see you all then, inshallah. If you can recite a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Depending on moon sighting, but most likely, yeah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا وارث آدم صفوة الله. السلام عليك يا وارث نوح النبي الله. السلام عليك يا وارث إبراهيم خليل الله. السلام عليك يا وارث موسى كليم الله. السلام عليك يا وارث عيسى روح الله. السلام عليك يا وارث محمد حبيب الله. السلام عليك يا وارث أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن محمد المصطفى. السلام عليك يا ابن علي المرتضى. السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء. السلام عليك يا ابن خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك يا ثار الله وابن ثاره والوتر الموتور. أشهد أنك قد أقمت الصلاة وآتيت الزكاة وأمرت بالمعروف ونهيت عن المنكر وأطعت الله ورسوله حتى أتاك اليقين. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، أشهد أنك كنت نورا في الأصلاب الشامخة والأرحام المطهرة، لم تنجسك الجاهلية بأنجاسها ولم تلبسك من مطلهمات ثيابها. وأشهد أنك من دعائم الدين وأركان المؤمنين. وأشهد أنك الإمام البر التقي الرضي الزكي الهادي المهدي. وأشهد أن الأئمة من ولدك كلمة التقوى وعلام الهدى والعروة الوثقى والحجة على أهل الدنيا. وأشهد الله وملائكته وأنبياءه ورسله أني بكم مؤمن وبيا بكم موقن بشرائع الدين وخواتيم عملي، وقلبي لقلبكم سلم وأمري لأمركم متبع. صلوات الله عليكم وعلى أرواحكم وعلى أجسادكم وعلى أجسامكم وعلى شاهدكم وعلى غائبكم وعلى ظاهركم وعلى باطنكم. السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله. السلام عليك يا ابن نبي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن الحسين الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها المظلوم وابن المظلوم. لعن الله أمة قتلتك، ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك، ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. السلام عليكم يا أولياء الله وأحباءه. السلام عليكم يا أصفياء الله وأوداءه. السلام عليكم يا أنصار دين الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار رسول الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار فاطمة سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي محمد الحسن بن علي الولي الزكي الناصح. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي عبد الله، بأبي أنتم وأمي طبتم، وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم، وفزتم فوزا عظيما. فيا ليتني كنت معكم فأفوز معكم. السلام عليك يا أبا الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن سيد الوصيين. السلام عليك يا ابن أول القوم إسلاما، وأقدمهم إيمانا، وأقومهم بدين الله، وأحوطهم على الإسلام. أشهد لقد نصحت لله ولرسوله ولأخيك فنعم الأخ المواسي. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك، ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك، ولعن الله أمة استحلت منك المحارم وانتهكت حرمة الإسلام. فنعم الصابر المجاهد المحامي الناصر، والأخ الدافع عن أخيه المجيب إلى طاعة ربه الراغب فيما زهد فيه غيره من الثواب الجزيل والثناء الجميل. وألحقك الله بدرجة آبائك في جنات النعيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا تسعة المعصومين من ذرية الحسين، علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن، عجل الله فرجه وسخر الله مخرجا وظهورك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك توعا وتمتيه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.